Welcome, everybody. It's lovely for you all to have joined us. I'm Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance Magazine. And this webinar is all about making good decisions, boards making better decisions. We're really lucky to have David Mansfield and Liz Mohr with us today. David is chairman of Radar and former CEO of Capital Radio. He's served on the boards of Carphone Warehouse, Game Group, music festivals, Ingenious Media, Results International, and many others. And he published The Monday Revolution in 2020 and Monday Revolution Essentials in 2025, which are management books inspired by lessons from his own successes and mistakes. And then Liz works with executive and non-executive leaders in some of the toughest industries and contexts to help them improve the leadership of their organisations. She draws on behavioural and strategic experience and research to help individuals, teams and boards develop capabilities, behaviours and performance. Her supportive and rigorous approach helps her clients become more effective and fulfilled at work. They're both contributors to governance, I'm pleased to say. David's latest article appeared in the September issue this year, and Liz's in the October issue last year. And they are also both members of the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Diploma faculty. We will be taking questions. We would encourage you to ask questions, but we would ask you if you don't mind waiting till the presentations have finished. But please feel free, if you can pop your questions in the Q&A at any time as we go through. And then at the end of the session, I'll curate the questions for Liz and David. So I think I'm now handing over to Liz, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. That's great. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. So we're going to do a bit of a double act, David and I. We've never worked together before, although we have a shared interest in decision making and boards. So hopefully that will work between the two of us. As Leslie said, I'm more of a practitioner and a consultant, so I do lots of board reviews and board coaching and things like that. So I've really got a kind of academic and an outside-in perspective, whereas David very much has the academic, but also the inside-out perspective. So you'll probably hear quite different things from us. So what we wanted to do, we'll probably speak for about half an hour or so and then have lots of time for questions. So I was just going to talk broadly and generally about some of the things that we know about boards and decision making and what improves them, and also how that changes in high velocity environments. And then David is going to do more of a deep dive into intuition and the research that he's been doing about how intuition is effective or not, or shapes decisions. I'll let him say what he's going to say. So I'll start off actually by defining high velocity. So thinking back to my physics A level, remembering that velocity has both direction and speed. A high velocity environment is one that academics would say is where there's a lot of change, and it's a lot of change in different directions, which obviously makes things more unpredictable, more uncertain. And I think a lot of organizations and a lot of boards would probably say that they're in a high velocity environment at the moment. I'm not quite sure if they would all qualify for it, but it definitely seems that a lot of people are struck by that. I would think of a couple of examples, and I'm probably going to use these later on when I talk about some general decision making. But so a kind of a classic example I would think of here would be Thames Water, potentially, who've been in a super high velocity environment. So, you know, having to get a kind of rescue financing package, not knowing whether they're going to be able to do it, their bidder falling out, announcing massive bonuses and retentions for their directors, then that having kind of backlash from the public and having to renege on that. And so, you know, I think they're still not quite sure what they're going to do with their refinancing. I haven't actually read anything about it in the last couple of days, but kind of super high velocity for them. And then another example, which everyone will probably remember from last year or maybe 23, I don't know, was the Nigel Farage and Coutts Bank situation. So another one where Nigel Farage was debanked, and Coutts said it was for commercial reasons, but it then became very clear that this was because that there had been some values-based kind of analysis of Nigel, and it became a big furore. The CEO of NatWest had to resign. I think the board were getting their information through the press or through Nigel's sources as opposed to through their own sources. And so again, another example of, you know, very high velocity, also very visible situation for a board. So also the cyber attacks as well, you know, because there are actually loads and loads of examples of people who are in this environment. So I thought it might be helpful to think about some of the things about decision-making boards that we know are effective, and then think, well, how does that change when you're in this new souped-up environment? So based on the research that we did last year, so in the article that Leslie referred to, and I'm pleased she said it was last year because I couldn't actually remember when it was, but based on the research that we did last year, we know a few things about boards and when their decision making is better. So we know that decision making is much better when boards do things in an iterative way. So when they have like several opportunities to look at the same decision in a kind of not formed, more formed, and then a finally formed package, if you like. And we also know that boards do better when they're presented things as a series of options. So like different ways of doing things to debate as opposed to a final fait accompli. Of course, in these high velocity environments, that's not always going to be possible. Things are coming at you left, right, and center. And so it can take away the ability to do that. Now, lots of boards, as lots of you will know, do scenario planning and run simulations and things like that. So you can probably predict as a board some things that are going to happen. I suspect that kind of Thames Water may have predicted bidders falling out and things like that. They may not have predicted the backlash that happened about the retention packages. They may have done, I don't know, but to some extent you can mitigate by introducing scenario planning for options and things like that. But it's definitely something that is taken away potentially when you're in this kind of high velocity situations. We also know that boards do better when they are given the right information and have access to information and resources. So whether that's through getting to know the organisation and the management, through the board papers, through access to the external environment. And again, in this high velocity environment, that is something which may well go. So think back to Coutts getting their information from the press or from Nigel Farage's PR people, as opposed to from the actual organisation, very blindsided by what was going on potentially. So that is lost potentially in high velocity environments. And then the other thing that we know is that boards do much better when there's diversity. So when there's diversity of people, and also everyone is allowed to speak. So, we have the kind of chair being a bit of a conductor to the board is really helpful. So they know which voices to put in. They know when people aren't speaking. It takes time to do this kind of thing. And one thing that happens when people are under a lot of pressure, there tends to be more deferral to the loudest voice almost, or the hierarchy becomes more important. And people who have new and different information are less likely to bring it forward. So there's more likely to be reliance on the well-known information or on the loudest voice, and confirmation bias and all those things step in. So there's even more onus on the chair and on processes to make sure that different voices are heard. But it's difficult, it's a trade-off, it's a balance. So it's an extra pressure for organisations, boards. So some of the basic things that we know are good are under pressure in high velocity environments. There's also a couple of other things that people tend to do in these situations. So one, that we know that when people are under pressure of speed and pressure of choice, and also when they're very visible in their decisions, that there's a bias to action. So people feel more inclination, and groups in particular feel more inclination to act, to do something. It makes them feel in control. So even if the right choice is to do nothing, there's a bias to actually, no, we've got to do something, we've got to take some action, the bias to action. And I almost wonder if that was going on. I don't know if you all remember the OpenAI and the Sam Altman situation. Part of me looks at that and thinks that sounded like it was a bias to action. I mean, I have no more information than anyone else does in the public, but it's a kind of a classic, we've got to take action, we've got to do something just to kind of take control of the situation. So that's something to be mindful of that will happen in boards. And then the other one that I was going to mention was risk appetite as well. So we know that, when people are rushed, things are changing very quickly, risk appetite can go up. And particularly in a group, and in a board situation, it can be amplified. And so people might take actions that they wouldn't take anyway. And if they had time to reflect or some kind of process to bring them back to their risk appetite, things might be different. But there is a kind of like increased propensity psychologically to take risk. It's quite difficult doing this webinar because I can't actually see anyone's faces, so I can't see if I'm going at the right speed here. But just like kind of running through, some of the things that I think good boards do in terms of decision making. And then the other one, the final one, which is where I'm going to hand over to David, really, which is about intuition. So that's definitely comes to the fore in these situations. And I know David has been doing lots of really good research on this. So David, can I hand over to you to talk through intuition and decision making?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks very much, Liz. Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for joining. Now, the title of my article, which some of you may have seen, the sort of subtitle, I suppose, was how you decide sort of determines what you decide. And as you'll hear as I sort of go through a few notes I have, it's about process. What process do we employ in order to make a good decision? And in my article, I pointed out that there is an awful lot of research which goes back a very long way, but unfortunately, improvements don't seem to have taken place in that a very high proportion of deals, strategic decisions don't deliver their intended outcomes. And so people start off with the best intention when they invest some expenditure, some capital, they buy a new company or whatever it happens to be. But usually strategic decisions are important. In other words, they can affect the lives of the people that work in the company, can affect the organization. And in some instances, they can be fatal if people make the wrong decisions. And I've got one or two examples of those. So what I'm going to do really is just give you a sort of an outline really of what I've been looking at, and then I have a number of examples and case studies, and some of these will be familiar to you. And I'm going to look at the processes that the people employed in those situations, both good and bad, and to see, well, what could we learn from them? And as we sort of come to the end of those, I'm going to look at the role of intuition and, if you like, facts and rationality, and sort of say, well, what role do they play when people are making decisions in these very fast-moving environments, and how could we capture both of those inputs to try and get a better outcome? How could we achieve the goals that we really set out to achieve in a backdrop where actually around 50% of companies and organizations don't achieve what they set out to do? So the research that I've been looking at, I've been doing this for around 4 years, and the basis of my research has been academic research. So I've been studying at 2 different universities, and I'm currently in the 3rd year of a doctorate, and I have reviewed an awful lot of case studies and an awful lot of academic papers. And what I've tried to do is to couple that with my own experience. And as Leslie said, I've sat on a number of boards from really startups to publicly quoted companies. And I have been part of some terrible decisions. I mean, there's no question of that. So I'm not coming at this as I know better. I'm trying to learn from some of my experiences, which hopefully that I've done. So the key question really in any environment, but let's sort of stick with high velocity environments for the moment. The key question in any environment really is, how should we make this decision? What do we know, and on what don't we know? And experience, case studies and research tells us that there's really no one size fits all in making a decision. And we'll come on in a second to an example of a company that thought that there was only one way of doing it, and it didn't go terribly well for them, and they learned from that. So really my first point is, if you guys are involved in making strategic decisions, sure, you might have a framework, you might have a way that you've done it in the past. That's important, but don't assume that that is going to be suitable for the investment or the acquisition you're going to make, particularly in a high velocity environment. And we've got a couple of examples of how you can adapt high velocity situations from low velocity situations. In other words, you could take something perhaps you've done in the past in a more pedestrian environment and adapt it to something which is more fast changing. So really, we need to start out with sort of what do we know already, what don't we know, and therefore, how can we start to frame our thinking? And looking at a few examples now, if we take, for example, Rolls-Royce. So when the new chief executive of Rolls-Royce joined the company, he described it as a burning platform. And the reason he described it as a burning platform was because he said that nearly all the acquisitions that the company had made since well for the previous years had destroyed value. And one of the reasons that he said that was that Rolls-Royce, and we take Rolls-Royce as a sort of proxy for lots of different companies, had made the mistake of assuming that similar acquisitions required a similar process. So I'll give you an example, and this is a different company that I spoke to the other day, and the chief executive of that company told me that quite simply, they had made an acquisition, it had been successful, they'd integrated it, they'd allocated their resources to it, and it had worked very well for them. And so they embarked on making a similar acquisition in similar circumstances. And because they already had this framework, if you like, and they had their previous knowledge, what they did was they saw this as a shortcut. So they felt there wasn't a particular need to do certain types of due diligence because they assumed that things were the same. And then when they bought the company, they found contextually it was very different. It was a very, very different situation where what they bought, had they spent a longer time looking at it, had they opened the bonnet and dug more into the sort of the engine room, if you'd like, they'd have found that what they were buying on the surface seemed similar, but actually it was very different. So back to my point, you might start off with a process, but really you can't assume that one is going to be the same as another. I'll give you an example of a situation, a high velocity environment for a food company. So the food company was a supplier to consumers of high quality food, and at very short notice, their key supplier, a chicken supplier, was unable to supply. They got shut down due to disease within their free-range chicken environment. And the executives of that organization found themselves in a really difficult high velocity situation. How could they meet their customers' needs? How could they organize supply in a high velocity environment? They couldn't do what they would normally do, which was to go out and review suppliers, look at prices, look at deliveries, and so on and so forth. They had to make some really quick decisions, and in that situation, which they managed to do, they took a combination of what they already knew, their intuitive experience, and the facts and data that they had in front of them in order to make a decision to renew their replace their supply chain, which is exactly what they did. So in that high velocity situation, they weren't able to do what they would normally do, but they survived it by taking part of what they'd done in the past and applying their intuitive experience. I was involved some time ago with a communications company, and the board of that company had decided that they had a lot of cash in the bank, and that can often be quite dangerous. So they had a lot of cash in the bank. They wanted to invest it. They weren't a bank. They wanted to be able to invest that in order to build on their organization. And so strategically, they decided, and this happens quite a lot, they decided that buying one of their suppliers would be good use of this cash. And they were a communications company. They made a lot of corporate videos for their clients. Their corporate video supplier came to them and said, look, we're available for sale. And a number of people have approached us, but we want to sell our business to you. Would you be interested? And the communications company said, yes, we hadn't considered that, but that's a good idea because we have an empty floor in our building. We have cash in the bank. You're a supplier to us, and actually, if you joined us, we could probably sell your services to a lot more of our clients. So this would seem synergistic. It will be good. It will expand our business. So let's go ahead and buy a production company. Luckily, they took some outside advice, which is important. They took some outside advice and didn't progress. Well, why wouldn't they progress? Because this seems absolutely reasonable and a good thing to do. But actually, when you looked at the two businesses, they were very different. And the principal difference was that the communication company had a regular income because it was charging its clients a fee every month. So providing they didn't lose their clients and providing the contracts weren't terminated early, they could predict their revenues absolutely. And that's a very high quality of earnings. The production company couldn't do that because the production company was dependent on one-off sales. And even if it joined this organization, it would still be dependent on one-off sales. Furthermore, it had very high capex requirement because equipment needed to be upgraded. It was a competitive edge. And if you don't have the latest technology in that marketplace, you aren't going to get hired. Thirdly, when they looked at it closely, they couldn't be confident that this cross-selling would take place. So even though the production company was there and available, they couldn't be sure that their executives actually would present it properly to their clients. So the net result of all of that was they didn't go ahead and do that acquisition. And I think that was very wise of them because the metrics and the financials of that acquisition were very different to the business, and it would have diluted and destroyed the quality of their earnings because the finance model was very different. So they looked at it, they adapted their process, they took some independent outside advice that wasn't an interested party. They weren't going to get a fee for this deal going through. So in that situation, it went very well. So and as Liz says, you need to be very cautious. One needs to be very cautious about what's going on within the boardroom environment, particularly in high velocity environments, because what happens is you find that personalities and dominance and loudest voice, as Liz was saying, and hierarchy and power and ego can interrupt a process when there isn't the time to make proper considered decisions. And so in those situations, one needs to have a shorter time frame process, not say there isn't a process that we can adopt here, so we're going to do what we think is the right thing to do, because a gut feel, an intuitive response often can end up in disasters. And the chief executives and the directors that I've interviewed often say, well, we made that decision and we should have been more considered. We should have done it differently, but at the time it felt the right thing to do and momentum took place. I interviewed a non-executive director of Sainsbury the other day, and I said, well, I can see that Argos is up for sale and you bought Sainsbury's 10 years ago, and this person is no longer involved in the organization. Why was buying Argos a good idea? Can you explain what was going on there? And he said, quite simply, we fell in love with it. And we got to the point where we told people that we were in that market and we couldn't stop it. And I noticed in a financial review the other day, it pointed out, and I don't know how true this is, but that Argos was probably valued at the same price they bought it for 10 years ago. And that was no bad thing. Well, actually, it was a terrible thing, really, because that income, that money could have been spent on something else, or at least not spent at all. And as it is, that Argos deal has destroyed value for Sainsbury's shareholders. So this situation regarding confirmation bias and hierarchy and loudness of voice, does take prevalence. Let me give you two government examples, and then I'll probably draw it to a close. So there's the government some weeks ago, probably some months ago now, decided that they were going to intervene with British Steel because British Steel was running out of money. They needed to keep the furnaces on because turning them off would cause all sorts of difficulties for the employees that there. I think there was like 3,000 people employed there. So the government have special powers to purchase or invest in organisations, and the ministers concerned can exercise these special powers in certain circumstances to step in. So this was a high velocity environment where the decisions had to be made very quickly. So they intervened back in April in order to save the business. But one of the things that they were supposed to do in that situation was they were supposed to look at what value this would create or destroy for taxpayers before they took that step. And the minister concerned was Jonathan Reynolds, and he responded and said that they couldn't take the advice of the permanent secretary in that situation simply because they didn't have time. So what you had there was that, so when people had originally said we want to give government special powers in certain circumstances, they invented a process which was never going to be fit for purpose, because it was very likely the government would only want to intervene in high velocity environments, but they provided them with a low velocity process. And that low velocity process was never going to work in a high velocity environment. So really what the government needs to do is to revisit that and say, in emergency situations, how do we decide? We shouldn't be deciding the way that we originally designed. And I think COVID is a really good example of this too, because we'll all remember at the early days of COVID, where people said, we need a vaccine here. This is what's required. We need a vaccine, but it takes 5 years to get a vaccine. So that's almost an impossible task. But what we found in that high velocity situation was that if we revisited how we looked at vaccines, in fact, that process didn't have to last 5 years. In fact, it was shortened into a considerably narrower time frame, and we came up with a vaccine. So in other words, precedent can get in the way of a process in high velocity environments. And therefore, if we're in a high velocity environment, sure, what do we already know? But what process should we use here? So I'll come on now to finally just talk about intuition, because this is really important. And my research in intuition basically shows, and this is a simplified version, but it's essentially true, is that companies start off with a rational approach. So let's look at facts, let's look at data, let's look at information, and that's our rational approach to making this decision. However, in a high velocity environment or even a low velocity environment, often things become very messy, very difficult, competition cuts in, markets change, and so on and so forth. So that linear approach, the linear approach that's taught in business schools, often doesn't survive in strategic decision making, because along the way, it starts to crumble sort of halfway or 2/3 of the way through. And in those situations, you find in boardrooms that people start voicing their opinions, their feelings, and they will say things like, well, we haven't got time now to do this. Intuitively, this feels like the right thing to do. And I'm the chief executive. I'm paid for my experience, and my experience, my intuition tells me that this is the right course of action. And so what you have there is a polarization, in effect. You have on one hand, the facts and figures approach often doesn't survive. So therefore we flip over to an intuitive and feeling approach, and that's how the decision is made. And in the research that I'm doing currently, and I'd be really grateful if anyone would like to join in, because I'm very keen to talk to anybody on this call who has their own experiences. This all anonymous. It's all done under Cranfield University's ethical code, so nothing is ever mentioned to anybody other than me. But I'm interested in examples of this, because the research shows that actually, if you combine and incorporate facts and data with intuition and you use them to validate each other, you will probably have a better outcome. So let me just explain that briefly. So what that would mean is, let's say that we've got facts here that are telling us that we might pursue a certain course of action. But if our feelings are telling us for some reason that doesn't feel right, we need to go into those things. We need to understand, well, hang on, what's going on here? If our intuition is telling us that the facts aren't going to give us the right answer or the right result, we need to investigate why that is. Not just leave it as, well, I'm going to use my intuition because the facts aren't right. And equally, if our intuition is telling us to pursue a particular angle, then we need to validate our intuition and not just go it. Because as Liz says, intuition is full of bias, right? Intuition is a subconscious retention of previous experiences, and our mind is not good at filtering these. And so quite often our intuition will mislead us, and and it appears within society it's quite acceptable to say, well, in this situation I'm going to follow my gut, and people write books about this as if it's a good thing, and it isn't a good thing. It isn't a good thing without validation. And if you want to see a great public example which is served up in front of millions of people every week, go and watch an episode of Traitors. Because if you watch an episode of Traitors, the amount of times people sitting around that table go, you know what, I'm just going to follow my gut. Just look at the number of times they're wrong, right? Because they can't validate it. They just go with their feelings. But that appears to be acceptable, and mostly it isn't. So I gave some examples in my paper. I talked about Sainsbury's and Argos. If you have a look around now, you'll see Coca-Cola spent billions on Costa Coffee a few years ago. That's destroyed billions of dollars for shareholders in that organization, because they're now selling it at a fraction of the price they bought it for. I would contest that they'd used a better process, they might have done that deal differently. Morrison's couldn't give their annual report a public airing when they bought Safeways, because they had no idea what their profits were in trying to integrate that business. Tesco launched Fresh and Easy in America. It was a disaster. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that these things are easy, but go and have a look at Wood Group. That was a business which had a capitalization of 5.3 billion, and today it's worth just over 150 million. It has been destroyed by bad decision making and bad process. So my takeaway for this is number one, having some sort of formal process for deciding, recognizing data and experience-based intuition are complementary and not substitutes, is a good starting point. Two, seek opinions from people who aren't invested in the decision. And by that, I certainly include corporate finance people, lawyers, etc., 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 people who don't have any responsibility for the outcome. But if you can find people who can stand back from it, that's very valuable. And that's what happened in the situation with the corporate comms company not buying the production business. And thirdly, and this is by a behavioral psychologist called Gary Klein, and he suggests that, and I think this is a good idea. I find it. I try to imagine the board meetings I was at, thinking if anyone would actually do this. But his suggestion was that you have a pre-mortem, not a post-mortem. So you suggest that once this deal is done, hypothetically, and actually none of the synergies really show up, the sales don't grow, and it turns out to be a corporate disaster. So, and the reason for doing that is to say, how can we anticipate and mitigate that before we buy this organization? So that's my take, Liz, and I hope people found that interesting and maybe valuable.
Thank you, David. I know that there are lots of questions in the chat, and Leslie will help us with them. Just on your final point about pre-mortems, I have actually done that with boards several times, and it has been a really, really helpful exercise. So it's something that I would recommend, just thinking in advance what could possibly go wrong. Before Leslie moves on to her questions, I just have one for you, which is a very practical one, David. So if you have someone in your board, so whether you're a board member, an exec or an advisor, someone who's really kind of over-indexing, if you like, on intuition and saying a lot about, oh, my gut feel is this, or my intuition is this, how have you got any advice about how to respond and how to manage that situation?
Well, yes, I have, and I've been in those situations. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was chairing a board of a fairly young company, but a very accomplished company, and went on to be very successful. Myself as chairman and the CFO had put together a paper which was very factual, very data based on an investment that we wanted to make. And so we presented it at the board meeting, and the chief executive said, you know, I don't think I can fault this. You know, I can't pick any holes in it. Well, you've done exactly what we required in terms of information. It all looks really good. And we said, oh, good. He said, but we're not going to do it. I said, well, why not? And he said, because it doesn't feel right. And so we didn't do it. But what we didn't do is we didn't say, okay, well, let's explore why doesn't it feel right? What are you uncomfortable with? How can we get comfortable with this? What is it that's going on here that makes you feel this isn't a good decision? And so really what we're saying is, I mean, it's not perfect, of course, but actually investigating that intuitive response to the facts might have been helpful. And we might have been able to get the chief executive more comfortable with progressing at least to the next stage with that. But we just took it, and he wasn't an ego tripper, you know, he was a good guy and a good listener. But we didn't pursue it. I remember many years ago when I was chief executive, when I was commercial director of Capital Radio, we wanted to buy a billboard business, a poster business in the UK. And you know that doesn't sound outrageous because in America, lots of radio stations own poster businesses as well, and there were a lot of sort of synergies there. They said, right? And we were restricted by the amount of radio stations we could buy. And so we looked at the poster business, and our chairman, who was very experienced but very powerful, you know, we had the presentation all ready to go. We put the first slide up, and he said, "I don't like posters," and that was it. So we didn't go any further than that. So I think you need to create an environment where responsible challenge is acceptable. That would be my answer, I guess. Really, and I'm not saying that's easy because culturally boards are, you know, they're a minefield of egos and power and their self-interest. I mean, let's not deny it, they are. So, you know, you need to recognize that. I think probably as chairman, sort of say, okay, well, there's lots going on here. You know, how can we? And if you have a process in place which a board or a group of people have signed off to, it does help keep people on track.
We can see there's a question in the chat actually asking about the role of the chair and the role of different people in all of this. And I think you probably kind of partially answered the role of the chair one, but one of the key roles of the chairs is to set the environment where people do feel free to challenge and free to talk and free to bring their views when other people are saying other things. So to have established some norms in easier times is always a great thing. So to have established that board culture. And the chair is just fundamental in doing that and making sure that that continues in these difficult situations. But I don't know, Leslie, do you want to give us some questions?
Yes, of course. Thank you, all of you. There's some really fascinating questions here. There's a couple of sort of practical ones. Someone's asked where they can find David's work on how you decide determines what you decide. Now, obviously, there is an article in the September issue of Governance, but you have to pay for that. You have to pay a subscription. David, is your work available anywhere where people don't have to pay for it?
Yeah, it's available from me.
Well, that brings us on to the next question. Someone has asked whether or not we can share your LinkedIn profile so that people can contact you after the event.
Yes, please do.
So you're both happy. So we'll do that when we send around the link to the recording. We'll make sure we include both David and Liz's LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, and if you ask if you'd like a copy of the article, I have a one-page copy, which I hope Leslie doesn't sort of break any rules.
No, that's fine. I want to get the information out there. But if you would like to subscribe to Governance, we'd love to have you as well.
It's great. It's really good, isn't it, Leslie? Governance.
I haven't paid her to say that. And Sue's asked, is a high velocity approach similar to a crisis management approach?
Yes, it is. I think you know, a crisis management approach would certainly, you know, qualify within a sort of, you know, fast-moving, changing, high-velocity environment where things are not always obvious as to what you should do. And in those situations, I mean, it's part of my research, and I have my research is business research, so I've excluded, you know, lots of other categories. But for example, you know, paramedics and ambulance people are constantly in their day is full of high velocity environments. And that's where their intuition, their experience, when they can look at somebody and probably instantly know what's going on with them. So basically, you know, if you're injured and lying in the road, what you don't want is a paramedic on their first day. Okay. So what you want is somebody in a crisis who has been there before. So yes, I would say a crisis is certainly a qualification for a high velocity environment.
The only thing that I would add to that as well is about visibility. So I don't think visibility necessarily relates to one or other, but you know, people will behave differently if they know they are going to be very visible in their decisions. So in the Thames Water case or the Farage case, that might be there might be much more of a bias to action. I'm just making that up, by the way. I don't know what happened in those boardrooms, but there could be a stronger bias to action than there would be in the David's chicken case, for example. So I think how visible people know they're going to be in their decisions to the outside world and also to within the organisation does also have an impact. So that might feed into what would typically be a crisis situation.
Would that apply as well? Because NHS boards, they have public board meetings, don't they? So does that apply to sort of anyone sitting on an NHS board?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, I think NHS boards, and there may be some NHS board members watching this, I think NHS boards sometimes divert to having a board, not a board meeting, but a pre-meeting before the board, where actually lots of the kind of tricky stuff does get discussed and practiced, and then they move to the public meeting. I'm not saying they all do that, but I've definitely seen that tendency to happen. Yeah, with some thought given to how do we actually kind of choreograph this in public.
Thank you. So Damien has asked, do directors understand well enough the concept? I think this is probably going back to your Argos Sainsbury's example, David, that sunk costs aren't relevant for ongoing decisions. For example, why do boards miss the opportunity of backing away from decisions when they can, regardless of the amounts already invested?
Well, I mean, Liz, I'm sure would be well qualified to answer that. I think certainly from my point of view, it's there's a very good book, and I can't remember the lady who wrote it, but she's a Stanford professor and a poker player, and the book is called Quit. And basically, knowing when to quit is a very good idea. So if you take
Annie Duke, I think she's written.
Annie
Who
Duke,
wrote it?
that's right,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you take infrastructure is a very good example of sunk costs. So if you take HS2, you know, there was a point at which some people have said, and I've read papers on this, that actually we've spent enough now. This is a project which isn't going anywhere, so we need to write off the sunk costs and stop. But of course, no government wants to do that, because no government wants to be able to say that we've wasted, you know, billions of taxpayers' money. So they keep going and they waste even more. And this is not a political point, it's just how the world is, you know, they continue. And I think that there is a lot going on here. And companies, particularly organizations that have made public commitments to doing things, you know, even though the costs are sunk and they should stop, as Annie would say, they should quit. They don't. What do you think, Liz? Do you see that in your board?
Yeah, I think it's a very human condition to find sunk costs difficult to deal with. And I think even if we're aware of the tendency to ignore it, we need to have some kind of processes in place to kind of reframe things, and like, we have lost this much or whatever, so to kind of challenge ourselves. So I think putting processes in place to challenge the decision is the way forward. But I think it's a really human thing to do, sadly. Probably got some amazing evolutionary reason behind it.
Another question from Catherine. She says, a pre-mortem sounds akin to scenario planning, or do you see that as a different thing?
So scenario planning is more thinking about, well, if this happens, what will we do? And under this scenario, what will we do? Whereas a pre-mortem is kind of very specific. Let's pretend that we've done it and it's all gone wrong. Let's look back and say, what happened, what went wrong? And it's kind of easier almost. You get many more, much more salient examples of what could go wrong if you're looking back that way than if you're looking forward and saying what we should do. Well, that's the theory anyway. And I think it works in practice, but it's a different angle of looking at a decision.
What about, I've just read a recent article that Patrick Dunn, who's another one of our faculty, has put up on LinkedIn about board simulations. Do you think there's board simulations have a role to play in sort of helping to make better decisions, both of you?
Well, I sadly haven't read Patrick's article yet, so I'm not quite sure what Patrick said.
Very
But
recent. And he said
I
he
would
would.
say that there is lots of value in doing it, but I would be mindful of David's point, which is just because something worked well in that scenario doesn't mean that it's definitely going to work. You can't assume that it's going to work in real life. So David, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think sort of, you know, probably when companies are looking at the risk register, that's when they're sort of saying, well, if these are the list of risks, and how will we mitigate them, and what we do. I remember when I was on the board of Carphone Warehouse, the chief executive for Charles Dunstan, sort of, you know, he said, you know, the thing is that, you know, we spend a lot of time looking at the risk register, and then the things that happen are never on it, you know, which was sort of true, really. I think, I mean, if you take pilots, for example, you know, now they do. I have a connection with a captain of a Chinese airline 737 because he's studying where I'm studying, and he is looking at this. And one of his, you know, they go through an awful lot of role playing and scenarios, obviously, to see what they would do in certain difficult situations. And the challenge that that pilots have is because there are so many protocols and procedures that obviously they have to follow, it's almost like psychologically, when they have to move away from those things into a different set of circumstances and a different protocol, it's quite hard for them psychologically to do that. I think role playing and you know, simulation is hard to argue against as an exercise, but I don't think that I've ever seen. I've never been part of a sort of group that has successfully done it. And by that, I mean, could look back on it and say, well, thank goodness we did that because it's now played an important role. I can't recall that.
Fair enough. This is a comment rather than a question, but I think it's very interesting. As a neurodivergent CEO, I've had to learn about how to manage my decision making all my life. This is the natural compromise I've come to, i.e., emotions say one thing, and I keep these in check by actively going to find the facts. It leads to more consistent and better decision making overall. What's your comments on that?
Leslie, what do you think? Liz, what do you think?
I think that sounds as a reiteration, really, of what you were saying, in terms of actually, yes, emotions, listen to those emotions. They're there, but then they can direct what facts you go and look for and what analysis you do so that the two are balanced. So I think it's written as an agreeing comment, I would say. It was very interesting. And I never really had thought about the neurodivergent angle, and that would play into that, actually. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. And then Patricia's asked, how do you address the elephant in the room? Often boards are ego-driven, as you mentioned, David, and directors are defensive to do awareness or training sessions, especially in the investment industry. Everyone thinks they are a wonderful decision maker. So how would you go about addressing the elephant in the room?
Well, yeah, that's a big question. That's a big question, really. I mean, and there isn't a simple answer to that. But my response to that really is, let's say you start saying, well, look, okay, our competitive edge here, our success, and actually the reputations of the people in this room are going to be determined by the quality of the decisions we make. Okay, and if our reputations are dependent on the quality of the decisions that this board make, how can we make better decisions? And perhaps we have a history of not always making great decisions, or we can look around and see other decisions that haven't gone well. What can we do here? And I think in those situations, you know, if you said, okay, well, let's look at how we make decisions currently. Let's see if we can get a better process, because I think if you have a better process, it keeps people on track and it makes people more accountable, but recognizes that there is something here which is going to determine a better outcome, rather than having a sort of ego free-for-all where everyone just sort of chucks in and then the chairman says, well, you know, I mean, because what often happens in these situations is that, you know, if you're going to make an acquisition, once it's been decided by the board that it's a good strategic fit and it's sort of justifiable, and then people jump from that into valuation and synergies, and what do the management team on the other side think? And an awful lot of very important considered information on integration, for example, and culture is just missed out. It doesn't happen. So I think probably it's a long answer, but I think really boards need to have a realization that perhaps they need some way of making better decisions. And I think if a chairman can promote that, then you're in with a chance of bringing people together on it. And the finance industry, I'm not familiar with egos and how things are made, decisions are made, particularly in the finance industry, because I haven't been in those rooms. But I suspect it probably isn't too different to other areas like retail, for example.
Yeah,
Liz,
my perspective as a consultant and an advisor, and I've done quite a lot of work with finance and investment committees as well, just very practically, I tend to go with the science, lead with the science and depersonalize it to lead to some better kind of processes like David mentions. But I find those industries are very keen on the science and what other people are doing in decision science. And so just to take the personal aspect out of it and then almost sneak that in at the last minute when they don't realize it. So I do find that they are open, but you sometimes have to come at it from a different angle, and then having the processes in place and accepted is very helpful. But investment decision making are usually all over this. Really, investment committees, the ones that I've worked with, you know, are really quite sophisticated in my experience.
thank you. And then we've got Anthony's asked, in high velocity environments, it may mean that board meetings have also to be held more often than a traditional once a quarter. How do non-executive directors navigate this without necessarily delving into the executive roles?
That is a very good question that I'm going to pass to David, since he's been in both of those roles.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a question which surfaces all the time, doesn't it, really? So I mean, you can sort of start at the top and say, well, you know, we've all sat on boards where the non-executives seem to behave like executives. And then we've all sat on boards where non-executives seem to have no responsibility at all, and say, well, that's up to the executives, you know, and they don't really bring any contribution. So where the boundaries are for this is inevitably sort of blurred. I think that probably to answer the question here, one ought to look at what you're trying to achieve, what sort of decision you're trying to make. And I don't think there's any problem at all in involving executives and board members in the same room to try and reach the best decision. And I would argue that perhaps better decisions are reached. I'll give you an example, and I don't know if it's true, but it sort of seems to make sense. So I read some time ago, some of you probably read this too, that at Amazon, when they need to make a decision, it isn't the board that makes certain decisions, it's the board plus the executives. And so they assemble a group of relevant people at varying levels in the room, and then each person is given a one-page summary of what needs to be decided. So everyone's got the same information at the same time, and they're given, you know, half an hour to read through well, not half an hour for a one-page document, obviously, but, you know, given time to read through the background of the decision that's required. And then the chairman asks the most junior person in the room to go first. So you ask that person, what's their view, what would they take into account, and you go around the table and you make sure that the most senior people and that, you know, and the chairman goes last, in order to try and get some degree of objectivity into the decision-making process. I don't know whether that's true, but to me it sounds better than a lot of things that take place. So I think, to answer the question, finding, and it depends on the culture of the organization, of course, but finding a way of involving the executives with the senior people in the same room to try and help reach the best outcome, I think is a good thing.
You agree with that, Liz? Yeah, you're nodding, so I assume so.
Yes, I know that TikTok do something quite similar, I think, where they actually get someone who's relatively junior and very trained in facilitation to facilitate the meetings, some of the meetings, and so they are trained in bringing in the different voices in that way. Again, I read that, so it may not be true. I love how David starts the story with "it may not be true." So that was something I read, but I know that they, you know, they also have some quite sophisticated ideas about how to bring the two groups into the decision making.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And actually, to the point of how many times you have board meetings, one of our regular speakers on the diploma is a chap called Alan McWalter, who's a really good speaker, really experienced chair. And he went through a horrendous situation in a bank where it was just, if you ever come, he'll explain it. But they had 273 board meetings in a year because it was just that, they just had to. And I've got time maybe just for one more because I do want to finish on time. So someone says, how can we realise favourable outputs when the board is paralysed in a sudden high velocity environment? It requires action and decision making, yet yet they can be afraid to unpick what has put them in this position. So it's just something happening suddenly.
Yeah, I'm just reading that question. I can see it on
All right, good.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think about, have I ever been in a situation where the board's been paralysed?
Wondering whether this is thinking of a particular situation or circumstance, because actually I agree with you, David. I think it's quite unusual to see that behaviour, the kind of like freezing or paralysed behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that they go on to make the right decision, but I think, I'm trying to think of a situation where I might have been in where there's been something so sudden and impactful that the board hasn't been able to respond. I think in those situations, I'm thinking of my own personal situation here when I was CEO. Without going into detail, I think in my situation where I had something which was really important that we needed to make a decision on, what I did was I spoke to the chairman, the non-executive chairman, and I said, look, this has happened and we need to respond really quickly to it. And, we haven't got time to put a board meeting together or whatever. So I need your opinion and I need your support. And in that situation, I acted with the chairman to make a decision, and the chairman managed the other members of the board. I could deal with the executive directors. There were only, I think, 4 of us, and that was fine. We were in a room. I spoke to the chairman, and I said, "We're going to have to do this now. I mean, this can't wait. But I need you to cover it off with the non-execs, and I need you to support this if you agree with it." And that was what we did. So I guess that's probably as near as I've got to a situation of paralysis.
Thank you. And actually, Catherine, going back to when you were talking before about having the executives and the non-executives involved in the room, has commented, she says she totally agrees with that. Having been an executive and a non-executive, otherwise you risk making a decision in an isolation bubble, which I think we probably would all agree with. And I think how executives interact with non-executives is another whole topic for a different discussion.
There is a problem. For my research, I did an interview very recently with a very large organisation, and it was really quite clear that the hierarchy dominated everything, and people couldn't really move. You had to go through a process, so there was no agility. They couldn't adapt to circumstances because everyone had to go through these set hierarchies, which were very long-standing. And I think in lots of instances it was great. In other instances, it was an encumbrance. Really, it didn't work.
Thank you very much. Well, we do have to call it to an end there, I'm afraid. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Very much like to thank Elizabeth and David for your thoughtful and so interesting. And also like to thank all of you for your questions, which were just great. Well, I'm so sorry we didn't have a chance to get through all of them. We did try and get through as many as we could. We will be sending out the recording to you, and we will send out David and Liz's LinkedIn profiles so that you can contact them. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.